like to welcome you to our conference, and I'm very excited that you are here. And now I'm struggling with the, oh, I did a little bit too much. Okay, let me share a few observations as a starting point. So the title of our workshop is Closing the Carbon Price Gap, Public Finance and Climate Policy. And I apologize that my starting point of this workshop will be the recent IPCC report, Working Group 3, in the 5th assessment cycle. And the IPCC reports had a very peculiar understanding how to think about climate policy. Basically, within the IPCC reports, we have a common understanding that there is a climate externality, and the climate externality defines to a certain extent a kind of an emission gap. So what you can see here is this is the business as usual scenario. This is what will happen without any international climate policy. And here you have a kind of a trajectory which is consistent with some kind of low stabilization goals, like the 2-degree target, or some people would like to see a 1.5-degree target. And there's a gap between what will happen in the future and what should happen in the future. And some people try to understand this as a kind of an emission gap. Now, this emission gap can be translated to the upscaling of low-carbon energy supply technologies. And what you can see here is that there is a dramatic, dependent on the stabilization goal you would like to achieve, a dramatic upscaling of low-carbon supply technologies is required. So this is something what IPCC wants to communicate to the decision makers and to the policy makers. But there is also a hidden theme, and the hidden theme is all these transformation pathways requires a kind of a carbon price. And most of the models come up with an optimal carbon price, and some models try to replicate some kind of optimal timing of this carbon price issue. But meanwhile, we understood that carbon pricing is much more complicated than we thought. And we had a few chapters in the IPCC report on the policy chapters, but this policy chapters has been very much focused on the Pigouvian perspective, internalizing the climate externality. But now we realize that the subject of carbon pricing can and should be embedded much more broadly in the public finance stuff. So in here there are a few questions which can be perceived as the guiding question of this workshop. So what revenues could be generated by the means of carbon pricing? What could this be used to lower existing taxes or to reduce the public debt? What is the potential of this carbon revenues to increase public investments, and how does carbon pricing interact with investment decisions and international tax competition? And this is something which the recent IPCC report is quite silent. It's not a failure, but it's something which has to be addressed and should be addressed in the future. And therefore we thought it might be a fruitful starting point for our workshop here, not to think about the emission gap, but to think a little bit more from a holistic perspective, to think from a carbon price gap perspective. So this means that there are many motivations to impose a carbon price on the economy. So we could start to think about the optimal taxation, the double dividend issue, and the portfolio effects. And this leads to a situation where we have revenues, and these revenues could be used for investments. And then there's a third motivation, so the Pigouvian motivation, to internalize the climate impacts, at least at a domestic scale. We can think about the co-benefits, because we realize that most of our economies are in a second-best situation. And in a second-best situation, the likelihood is very high that co-benefits can be realized, can be materialized. And then there's a remaining gap. The remaining gap is due to international negotiations. But the feeling is, if we start to climb, so to say, the ladder of this, or to close this the carbon gap, the remaining gap for international negotiations, it's much lower than we thought. So this is at least the intuition, and let's see what will be achieved over the course of this workshop. Now, there's another aspect, which is, from my point of view, quite important, and this is what I would like to call the science policy interface. Thinking about carbon pricing, thinking about carbon pricing from different social perspectives, including different political and societal goals, is an important aspect. And climate policy and carbon pricing has an impact on multiple policy objectives. We as scientists, we can outline feasible courses of action and identify trade-offs. So we are not in a position to push for a specific set of objectives, and therefore these decisions are should be taken by policymakers because they have the legitimacy to do this, and this requires a kind of a public deliberation. So a few of you might have seen the debate in the blog, for example, of Rob Stebbins, what happened in the approval plenary in Berlin, where we had some problems with the governments because some of our governments raised concerns about scientific insights in our report. And they deleted some of the material. But this is was not just an issue that they do not like specific parts of our report. This refers to a much more important aspect. It refers to the important aspect to what extent scientists have the legitimacy to say something, to evaluate ex post policy instrument and institutions, and also to identify future design options. Now, this is something on the science policy interface where facts and values are intertwined. And it is, from my point of view, not just an issue for the future of IPCC, it's an issue how to define in a reasonable way the science policy interface. One metaphor might be helpful for that scientists can perceive themselves as map makers, without saying that it's just one goal which should be achieved, but there's a multitude of goals which can be achieved, and dependent on the goal policymakers will choose, dependent on that we can identify the pathways, the underlying costs, the underlying opportunities, and the underlying risk of these pathways. So the policymakers are the navigators, and the scientists are the map makers. And it is very interesting to see how the map makers and the navigators might interact in the future. In that sense, you can perceive this workshop as a workshop which has a twofold purpose. The first purpose is we can discuss issues just for the sake of scientific curiosity. And this is absolutely legitimate, it's a lot of fun, and hopefully we can have a lot of fun. But the second purpose is implicitly to think a little bit more about the science policy interface and to think about how can we evaluate real-world policy instrument and real-world policy institutions. And this workshop could be perceived, could be seen as a starting point to come up with a much more enlightened version of assessment reports compared to that what we have done previously. So I would like to mention a few words on the MCC, the Mikado Research Institute on the Global Commons and Climate Change. What we are doing in this institute, it's a very new institute, we try to elaborate a little bit more this metaphor of map making and the maps designed to be useful to the policymakers, and we try to understand the opportunities and challenges of sustainable economic growth in a resource and a carbon-constrained world, and carbon pricing is definitely something which is on our agenda. We have about 40 members here. It's quite a young and a new institute. And for today, I would like to highlight just one member of our institute, which is Christian Flaxland. He was very instrumental for the preparation of this workshop. And I would like to excuse Christian because he is sick because of a severe flu. This is a real pity, but I would like to convey our best wishes for his soon recovery. Now, this is the workshop for the agenda of the next few days. And basically what you can see is on the agenda is we try to answer all the questions I have highlighted from the very beginning on. So for today, we start with carbon pricing, public debt, and macroeconomic efficiency. Then we will move on rent taxation and macroeconomic efficiency. Then we have something on international capital mobility and tax competition. And then we also try to embed carbon pricing in a broader perspective of distributional impacts. And the agenda for tomorrow is then to continue this debate. And in the end, at the very last session, we try to come up to understand how to close the carbon price gap when we talk about international negotiation and international climate treaties. And also we have a few practical examples around the world how to raise revenues and how to use the revenues. And then on Friday lunchtime, we are basically then through the workshop, and then we try to come up with some kind of preliminary conclusions. So I hope that you will enjoy this workshop. It is very important. This is not a workshop about communication to the broader public. It's not a workshop that scientists communicate to the public. It's a scientific workshop. We want to understand the technicalities and the scientific insights. And also, we would like to provide a lot of opportunities for discussion, for brainstorming, and hopefully we would like to launch a social learning process. So the workshop presentations will be recorded. The interviews and statements with the individual participants will be taped. The discussion round operate under the Chatham House rule. Feel free to say everything what you want. And the workshop outcome will be published on the MCC website. Thank you very much, and I wish us all together good luck for this workshop, and I would like to hand over to Gib.
Thank you, Ottmar. Is the mic on? Great. So I just want to briefly thank Ottmar and the Mikado Research Institute for hosting this conference and for their gracious hospitality, and in particular to thank Susan Reinsch for her help in organizing, as well as Christian Flaxland, who, as Ottmar said, is ill and not able to attend. So governmental discussions on carbon pricing have focused on industry impacts and trade adjustment considerations for the most part, some discussion on distributional considerations, but increasingly politicians have realized the significant revenue potential of carbon pricing. If we look at the United States, a $20 per ton carbon price, for example, would raise roughly $100 billion annually. So in the U.S., there's great interest in tax reform on both sides of the political aisle, but politically it's very difficult, and it is certainly stalled in this mid-election year. But it does raise the question of whether a carbon tax can be part of a politically negotiated package to provide additional revenues to close the gap between Democratic and Republican perspectives on tax reform. Now, my sense is that Europe has been less focused on the role that carbon revenues can play in fiscal reform, and as Ottmar has indicated, our hope is that the presentations today will add to the ongoing discussion both in Europe and the U.S. on the role carbon pricing can play in moving a fiscal reform agenda forward. And as Ottmar indicated, we've included a session tomorrow where we get a whirlwind global tour of carbon pricing developments in a number of countries and regions, and this should emphasize our desire to go beyond a purely academic discussion to consider the practical and political concerns that need to be addressed in moving from theory and practice. So it is that science-policy interface that's quite critical. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Ottmar, for your hospitality. And now I'm going to shift my hat to that as the session organizer for the first session and ask Larry Goulder and Michael Jacob to join me up here.